Tonight, we're going to talk about a place so ancient that its name has become almost a whisper carried on the desert wind. A land where mud gave birth to cities, where reeds bent beneath the weight of the very first written words, and where two rivers, patient and eternal, cradled the earliest steps of what we now call civilization. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the quiet nature of these stories. And if you're listening right now, tell me in the comments where you are and what the hour looks like where you sit. It is always a soft comfort to imagine strangers from every corner of the world gathered here in the same still moment. So dim the lights, pull the blanket close, maybe let the hum of a fan blur the edges of the room, and let us walk together, gently, into the world between two rivers, into the deep memory of Mesopotamia. Long before pharaohs raised their tombs of stone against the Egyptian sky, long before the marble of Athens was ever quarried, long before Rome was even a rumour in the hills of Italy, another story had already been unfolding for thousands of years. It was a slower story, quieter, without the drama of legions or emperors, and yet it carried within it the seeds of every city that would ever rise on the face of the earth. It was the story of people who dared to stop wandering. The story of people who looked down at the mud beneath their feet and understood, perhaps without even the words to say it, that this soft, dark earth was not something to pass through, but something to belong to. And in belonging to it, they became the first architects of a new human world. The land itself is easy to picture, if you close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a wide horizon, flat and shimmering under a heavy sun. Imagine reed marshes rustling at the edges of shallow water. Imagine dust drifting between date palms. Imagine a sky that seems to stretch forever, unbroken except by the slow spiral of a distant bird. Now add the two rivers, silver ribbons of life cutting through that vast quiet. The Tigris to the east, restless, quick, sometimes violent. The Euphrates to the west, slower, wider, more forgiving. Both are born far away in the cold mountains of what we now call Turkey, fed by melting snow and stubborn winter rains. Both descend through valleys and plains until they meet the flat southern land where they spread out like open hands, letting silt and water settle into a rich dark soil. It was here, in this humble stretch of ground, that everything began. The Greeks, arriving centuries later and dazzled by what they found, named this land Mesopotamia, the country between the rivers. But the people who lived here first had no need of such a name. To them it was simply home. It was where the flood came each spring, sometimes gently, sometimes as a devastating wall of muddy water. It was where the sun burned so fiercely at midday that even the lizards hid. It was where at night the sky turned into a canopy of stars so bright and thick that it felt as though the heavens themselves leaned close to whisper. To live here required patience, cleverness, and a kind of quiet courage. And it was that courage that changed the human story forever. To understand how it all began, we need to travel back further still, past the pyramids, past the stone circles of distant Europe, past the painted caves where our ancestors once traced the shapes of animals by firelight. We need to go back to a time when the world itself was leaving behind the deep cold of the last ice age. For nearly 2 million years, humanity had lived inside a colder, harsher world. Great sheets of ice covered much of the northern lands. Winds blew across grasslands where mammoths grazed. Sea levels were low. Rivers ran differently. Humans, small in number and always on the move, followed herds across landscapes that shifted with every generation. They were survivors, resilient beyond imagining, but they never stayed long in one place. Home was a shoulder wrapped in fur, a hearth built and abandoned, a story told beneath the stars before moving on. Then, slowly, the ice began to retreat. Around 10,000 years before our own time, the world grew warmer. Glaciers pulled back into the mountains. Rain began to fall in new patterns. Forests spread across land that had been barren tundra. Rivers deepened and slowed. In the highlands and valleys of what we now call the Near East, something extraordinary happened. Wild grasses began to grow in dense, waving fields. Wheat and barley, once rare, now bent under the weight of their own heavy seeds. Pistachio trees dropped their nuts in such abundance that a family could gather more in a day than they could eat in a week. Herds of gazelle thickened along the hills. Rivers ran full of fish. For a people whose entire history had been shaped by scarcity, this was almost impossible to believe. It was as though the earth itself was inviting them to stay. And some of them did. Not all at once. Not with any grand plan. It happened the way most great changes happen, quietly, one small decision at a time. A family that had always returned to a certain river bend in spring began to stay a little longer each year. Another family, finding a valley rich with grain, decided that this autumn they would not follow the herds south. A group of cousins built a shelter that was a little sturdier than usual, meant to last more than a single season. They dug a small pit to store extra seeds. They shaped a hearth with careful stones, and when the next year came, they did not leave. They stayed. And in staying, they began, without knowing it, to invent an entirely new way of being human. Archaeology has given us small windows into these first tentative settlements. Along the Euphrates, at a place called Abu Huraira, we can still see the ghostly outlines of round huts made of mud and reed, huts where families gathered wild rye by the armful and crushed it patiently on stones worn smooth by generations of hands. At Muribet, not far away, families anchored themselves to a single spot on the river, building homes with real hearths, where children slept curled against the warmth of the fire. Storage pits filled with grain, tools kept carefully in the same place year after year. These people were not yet farmers in the way we would understand the word. They were still hunters and gatherers, still deeply tied to the wild rhythms of the land. But something had shifted. For the first time in the long unfolding of the human story, the world had a home in it. And then came Jericho. Around 9,000 years before us, in the quiet warmth of the Jordan Valley, something remarkable rose from the earth. Not a camp, not a village, a town. Its people built houses of mud brick pressed side by side, and around those houses they built something that no group of humans had ever built before. A wall of stone, thick and heavy, requiring the coordinated labour of dozens of people over many seasons. Nobody knows for certain why they built it. Some historians believe it was to hold back the seasonal floods that could sweep down from the hills. Others believe it was to defend against raiders who envied the town's stored grain. It may have been both, but whatever its purpose, that wall was a statement, silent but unmistakable. It said, "We live here. This is ours. We are not leaving." And within those walls they built a tower nearly 9 meters tall, with a spiral staircase winding upward into the light. It is the oldest known monument in the world. It rises still, in fragments, out of the dust, as if refusing to be forgotten. Farther north, on the plateau of what is now Turkey, another settlement grew that continues to astonish those who study it. Its name is Atlhaik, and it was unlike anything before or after. Imagine a town of thousands, 5, maybe 8,000 souls living pressed together in houses so tightly packed that there were no streets at all. To move through the town, people walked across the flat rooftops. To enter their homes they climbed down through openings in the ceilings, using ladders like the rungs of memory itself. Inside these dim, close spaces, they painted their walls with red bulls and leaping deer and dancing figures. They buried their dead beneath the floors, curled like sleeping children, so that the ancestors were never far away, always underfoot, always part of daily life. Life at Atlhaik was crowded, intimate, strange, and beautiful. It was one of humanity's earliest and boldest experiments in living together. But even Atlhaik, remarkable as it was not yet the full birth of civilization. That birth was still to come, quietly, without fanfare, in the fields just outside such towns. For while people were learning to live in permanent homes, another slower revolution was unfolding beneath their feet. The revolution of seeds. Of grain, of the humble decision to plant something and wait, patient as the sky, for it to grow. It was not invented in a moment. It was discovered 1,000 times, forgotten, remembered, tested, refined. People noticed that certain stalks of wheat held their seeds more firmly, and those were the seeds worth keeping. They noticed that some grains grew taller, some ripened earlier. Some resisted the wind better than others. Generation by generation, without realizing what they were doing, they were shaping the very plants around them, and the plants, in turn, were shaping them. By around 8,000 years before our own time, wheat and barley were no longer wild. They had become domesticated, dependent on human hands to plant them, tend them, harvest them, and store them, and in return they offered something no wild grain could ever offer: a promise. A promise that if you worked the earth in spring, and if the rains came, and if the flood was kind, you would eat in winter. It was the first bargain humans ever struck with the future, and it changed everything about what it meant to be alive. And with that bargain, on the muddy edges of 2 ancient rivers, the deep story of Mesopotamia truly began. Once that first seed had been pressed into the dark soil and had risen again as green shoots reaching toward the sun, something in the human soul shifted forever. It was more than the birth of farming. It was the birth of waiting, the birth of patience, the birth of a kind of faith no ancestor had ever needed before. The faith that if you gave something to the earth would give it back to you months later, multiplied. It sounds almost simple when we say it now, but for those first farmers standing barefoot in the mud of Mesopotamia, this was the beginning of an entirely new relationship with time itself. The seasons were no longer just moments that passed. They were promises. They were contracts written between humans and the soil, signed in sweat and dust, sealed by the rising and falling of 2 great rivers. Think for a moment of what this meant for a family that had, for countless generations, lived only in the present tense. A hunter did not think in months. A gatherer did not think in years. Their world was measured in the next meal, the next herd, the next ripe fruit hanging heavy on a branch. But a farmer had to think ahead. A farmer had to imagine autumn while planting in spring. A farmer had to save seeds when hunger whispered to eat them. A farmer had to trust the sky, trust the flood, trust the neighbours, trust the gods. And in learning to trust, humans became something new. They became planners. They became dreamers of futures they might never live to see. The rhythm of the year began to reshape their bones and their thoughts alike. In the cool damp of spring, seeds were placed in furrows carved by simple wooden sticks, sometimes pulled by human hands, later by the patient shoulders of oxen. In the long dry summer, water had to be carried, weeds pulled, birds chased from the ripening fields. In autumn, harvest came, that sacred hectic season when every hand, from child to elder, worked together to bring in the grain before the storms could ruin it. And in winter, when the fields lay bare, life turned inward, to storage jars, to hearths, to the mending of tools, to the telling of stories that carried memory forward like small, careful flames. The year became a great turning wheel, and human life turned with it. And beside these fields, another quiet transformation was happening. Animals, once only prey, became partners. It did not happen quickly. It happened in the slow, patient way that trust always builds between species. A wild goat, curious about the salt of a human camp, wandered close and was not chased away. A lamb, orphaned by a hunter's spear, was carried home by a child and given milk from a soaked cloth. A litter of piglets, born near a villager's refuse pit, grew up believing that humans were simply part of the landscape. Year by year, generation by generation, the wildness slowly softened. The great fierce aurochs, ancestors of cattle, taller than a man and armed with horns like sabres, were gradually gentled by careful hands over centuries. Sheep grew rounder, woollier, less prone to bolting. Goats learned to follow shepherds up hillsides. Pigs settled comfortably into muddy pens. And humans in return discovered milk that came reliably, hides that could be worked into clothing, wool that could be spun and dyed, meat that no longer required the danger of the hunt. The implications of all this were enormous. For the first time in the history of our species, food could be counted before it was eaten. It could be stored. It could be planned. And that surplus, that beautiful, terrifying surplus, was the seed of everything that would come after. Cities, kings, armies, temples, laws, all of it began the moment a family looked at their harvest and realized they had more than they needed. More barley than they could grind. More lambs than they could butcher. More milk than they could drink before it spoiled. What do you do when for the first time in human history there is more than enough? You find ways to keep it, and so pottery was born, or rather, refined into something extraordinary. People had shaped clay for thousands of years, but now, around 6,000 years before us, the technology took a great leap. Clay was fired in hotter and hotter kilns, becoming stronger, denser, more waterproof. Jars grew large enough to store a family's grain for an entire winter. Bowls held oil that would not seep away. Pots kept water cool even under the harsh summer sun. It is hard for us, surrounded as we are by metal and plastic and glass, to understand just how revolutionary a simple fired clay jar truly was. But in those days, a well-made jar was wealth itself. It meant survival. It meant that if the harvest failed next year, this year's grain could still feed your children. It meant that meals could be cooked more efficiently, that liquids could be carried across long distances, that food could travel between villages and eventually between distant lands. Pottery, humble and easily broken, was one of the quiet miracles that made civilization possible. But surplus was never only a blessing. It was also a burden, and sometimes even a curse. A jar of grain sitting quietly in the corner of a house was not just food. It was temptation. It was the promise of survival for whoever could take it. For the first time, humans faced a problem their nomadic ancestors had rarely known. Theft, envy, raiding. If your neighbour's herd was larger than yours, did that make him blessed by the gods? Or did that make him a target? If a wandering group of strangers came down from the hills, hungry, desperate and armed, what would stop them from taking what you had spent a year growing? The answer, slowly and reluctantly, was walls. Guards, cooperation, rules, leaders, and so the Jericho Tower, and the tight-pressed houses of Athelhike, and the mud walls that began to rise around every prospering village, all speak of the same quiet truth. Where there is grain, there must be protection. Where there is protection, there must be organisation. And where there is organisation, there must be someone, or some group, to decide who is protected and who is not. The first leaders were probably not kings. They were probably the wisest of the elders, or the strongest of the warriors, or the most respected of the storytellers. They probably did not think of themselves as rulers at all. But they were the seed of something that would one day become thrones, dynasties, and empires. Every crown that has ever been placed upon a human head has its distant root in a jar of barley kept safe through a hungry winter. Nowhere did this transformation press deeper than in the southern plains of Mesopotamia, where the two great rivers spread wide and shallow across the flat earth. Here the soil was so rich, so black with silt carried down from the northern mountains, that a handful of it could seem to grow crops all by itself. But here also the challenges were sharpest. The rains were sparse. The summer heat was murderous. And the floods, when they came, were violent and unpredictable. One year the Tigris might rise so high that entire villages were swept away in a single terrible night. The next year the Euphrates might barely rise at all, leaving fields parched and children hungry. To live here, to truly thrive here, humans had to learn to bargain not just with the earth, but with water itself. And so they began to dig. Slowly at first, then with growing confidence. Small ditches at the edges of fields, then longer channels stretching across the plain, then true canals, sometimes many kilometres long, carrying the precious water of the rivers into fields that would otherwise have known only dust. This was irrigation, and it was another quiet revolution in the story of our species. With irrigation, the productive land was no longer limited to the narrow banks of the rivers. Entire regions that had been barren could suddenly bloom. Villages could grow into towns, and towns could grow into something larger still. But irrigation, unlike a simple hut or a family field, could not be built or maintained by a single household alone. It required dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of hands. It required agreements about who would receive water and when. It required overseers to ensure that no one took more than their share, judges to settle disputes, workers to clear silt from channels every year before the flooding began. In digging canals, the Mesopotamians were also, without knowing it, digging the foundations of government. Every shovel of earth thrown aside carried within it the future shape of society. Every decision about which field would receive water on which day was in miniature the birth of law. Every argument settled by a wise elder was a small ancestor of every court that has ever convened since. Water, which had always seemed to belong to the gods alone, was becoming a resource to be shared, managed, and above all, organised. And a people who could organise water could eventually organise almost anything. By around 7,000 years ago, in the deep south of Mesopotamia where the marshes met the plains, small settlements began to gather along the water channels. Their names would one day become legendary, but in these first centuries they were still humble places of mud, brick and reed. Eridu was one of the earliest. According to the memory of the Mesopotamians themselves, later written down on clay tablets, Eridu was the first city founded by the gods themselves, and though we cannot verify such claims, archaeology has shown that by nearly 5,000 years before our era, Eridu already had a modest but sacred temple built at its heart, dedicated to a god called Enki, master of the sweet fresh waters that made all life possible. In a land where water was everything, worshipping a water god was not superstition, it was survival dressed in the language of prayer. Not far from Eridu, another settlement was beginning to stir, one whose name would echo across every book of ancient history ever written. Uruk. In these first centuries, Uruk was little more than a cluster of homes built along shallow channels, tended by farmers, potters and shepherds. Its walls were still low, its temples were still small. But the seeds were already planted. Uruk would one day become the largest city in the world, home to tens of thousands of souls, cradle of writing itself, mother of kings whose names would still be spoken thousands of years after their bones had turned to dust. And it began, as all great things do, quietly, just a few families along a canal, hoping the next flood would be kind, teaching their children how to tell wheat from weeds. If you had walked through one of these early southern villages 6,000 or 7,000 years ago, you would not have felt as though you were standing at the beginning of the world. You would have smelled bread baking in clay ovens. You would have heard children shouting, animals bleating, women laughing beside jars of water carried on their heads. You would have seen men mending fishing nets in the shade of date palms. You would have watched an old woman shape clay into a bowl with hands that had done the same work for 50 years. It would all have looked, to your eyes, ordinary, just people, just life. And yet, invisibly, beneath the dust of their small streets, the deep bones of civilization were already forming, waiting for the moment they would rise into temples, palaces and cities that would astonish the world. The change from village to city did not happen in a single generation, nor even in a single century. It came slowly, almost secretly, like the way a river carves a canyon over thousands of quiet years. If you had lived through it, you would probably not have noticed it happening at all. Your grandfather's village had a few dozen houses. Your father's village had perhaps 100. Your own village, when you were old and grey, had grown to several hundred. Nothing extraordinary, just more children born than had died, more harvests gathered than lost, more canals dug than had ever been dug before. And yet, when you sat one evening on the roof of your home and looked out across the plain, you might suddenly have felt something strange. The horizon was full of smoke from cooking fires, voices carried from streets you did not know. Somewhere in the distance, a drum was beating for a festival you had not been invited to. Your village had become something else, something bigger, something with a life of its own that no single family could fully know. This was the birth of the city, and in southern Mesopotamia, along the muddy banks of the Euphrates and the marshes that fanned out toward the Persian Gulf, it was Uruk that led the way. By around 5,500 years before our own time, Uruk was no longer a modest cluster of homes. It had swollen into something the world had never seen before. Its walls, when finally raised in later centuries, would enclose an area of nearly 250 hectares. Its population, at its height, may have reached 50,000 souls, perhaps even more. To understand how astonishing that number is, imagine that for all the hundreds of thousands of years that humans had walked this earth, the largest group any single person had ever belonged to was a band of a few dozen, or at most a village of a few hundred. Now, in Uruk, tens of thousands of strangers were living together, working together, worshipping together, and somehow, miraculously, not tearing each other apart. How was such a thing possible? How could so many humans, most of whom would never even meet each other, share the same water, the same fields, the same streets, the same gods, without collapsing into chaos? The answer, the invisible mortar that held the first cities together, was organization. And at the heart of that organization stood the temple. If you had walked into Uruk in those early days, the very first thing you would have seen, rising above every rooftop, above every date palm, above every wisp of cooking smoke, was the temple. It was built on a raised platform of mud brick, whitewashed until it gleamed under the sun, so that it could be seen from miles across the flat plain. The White Temple of Uruk, as archaeologists now call it, was not simply a house of worship. It was the beating heart of the city. It was the granary. It was the treasury. It was the courthouse. It was the workshop. It was the schoolhouse. It was the place where the gods and the humans and the harvest and the herds and the canals and the merchants and the artisans all came together in a single, humming, sacred rhythm. Priests, or perhaps the earliest form of them, moved through its halls with quiet authority. They collected grain from the farmers, recording it carefully. They distributed rations to workers who spent their days repairing canals or digging new ones. They oversaw workshops where hundreds of women wove textiles that would be traded across mountains and seas. They kept livestock counted, oil measured, beer brewed, bread baked. They received offerings from families who prayed for a healthy child, a good marriage, a safe journey. And in all of this endless daily activity, they faced a problem that had never troubled any human society before. How do you remember all of it? How do you keep track of who has given what, who owes what, who has received what, when the numbers stretch not into dozens but into thousands? Human memory, no matter how sharp, could not carry such weight. Words spoken and forgotten could not settle disputes years later. Something new was needed. And so, in the storerooms of Uruk and the other rising cities of Sumer, one of the greatest inventions in all of human history began to take shape. It did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived humbly as the answer to a very practical question. How do we count? The first solution was tokens. Small pieces of clay shaped into different symbols. A little cone might stand for a small measure of grain. A sphere might represent a larger one. A tiny animal figure might mean a sheep. These tokens were kept in clay envelopes and sealed with marks so no one could tamper with them. It worked, for a while, but then someone, we will never know who, had a brilliant idea. Instead of storing tokens inside envelopes, why not press the shape of the token onto the outside of the envelope itself? And then, once you had the marks on the outside, why bother with the tokens inside at all? Just make the marks, draw the sheep, draw the jar, draw the number. And so, without knowing it, that anonymous accountant in Uruk had just invented writing. The earliest writing was not poetry, it was not prayer, it was not the epic tale of a hero, it was a receipt, it was an inventory, it was a note that said 3 jars of oil delivered by the priest, or 10 sheep received from the herder. It was practical, dry, almost boring, and yet from that humble root, one of the most transformative technologies in human history began to grow. Over centuries, the little pictures were pressed into wet clay with a cut reed, leaving wedge-shaped marks that scholars would one day call cuneiform. The pictures grew simpler, more abstract, more efficient. A drawing of a head began to stand for the word head, and then for the sound of the word head, and eventually for any word that shared that sound. Writing was learning to speak. It was learning to carry not just numbers, but ideas, not just inventories, but stories. And when at last it could carry stories, humanity gained something it had never possessed before. A voice that could survive its own death. Think for a moment about what that meant. Before writing, every song, every prayer, every recipe, every family history, every wise saying an elder had ever spoken, all of it lived only in the fragile memories of the living. When an old man died, an entire library died with him. Communities lost knowledge every generation. But now, in Uruk, a scribe could take a piece of soft clay, press words into it with careful hands, dry it in the sun, and that clay tablet could carry those words forward across centuries. A father could speak to a great-grandchild he would never meet. A king could send a message to a governor 100 miles away without ever leaving his throne. A law could be written down and consulted again and again, long after the mouth that first spoke it had turned to dust. Writing was memory made permanent. It was time itself bending to human will. Meanwhile, Uruk grew. Its streets, though narrow, were alive with a kind of activity no human eyes had ever witnessed. Craftsmen sat outside their homes shaping tools and jewellery. Potters worked at fast-turning wheels, producing in a single afternoon what once would have taken days. Copper began to be worked into sharper knives and sturdier axes, tools that made stone seem old-fashioned. Jewellers set beads of lapis lazuli, that deep heavenly blue stone brought all the way from the distant mountains of Afghanistan, into ornaments that gleamed on the wrists of priestesses and merchants. Carvers shaped small cylindrical seals from stone, engraved with tiny detailed scenes, so that any person of standing could roll their seal across a wet clay tablet and mark it as their own. A cylinder seal was the ancient equivalent of a signature, a fingerprint, a personal mark of authority pressed into the soft memory of clay. The markets of Uruk hummed with voices in many languages. Traders from the north brought timber and metals. Traders from the east brought copper and semi-precious stones. Traders from the south, coming by boat along the Gulf, brought pearls, shells, and rare spices, and in return, Uruk sent out its own wealth. Woolen textiles woven in massive temple workshops, barley from its fields, beer brewed in enormous quantities and prized across the ancient world, oil pressed from sesame seeds, pottery of every shape and size. The city was not just a place, it was a hub, a pulse, a node in a network of exchange that reached farther than anyone in Uruk could probably imagine, stretching all the way from the highlands of Anatolia to the valleys of the Indus, from the deserts of Arabia to the plateaus of Iran. And with such density of life came new problems no human society had ever faced. Waste, disease, crime, disputes over property. Arguments between neighbours, the old ways of solving quarrels, where a village elder simply listened to both sides and offered a wise word, could no longer manage a city of tens of thousands. Formal councils began to meet. Assemblies of respected men debated important matters, judges heard cases and delivered rulings, and gradually, over generations, certain figures began to rise above the rest. They were not yet kings, Not quite. But they were something more than elders. They were leaders whose authority stretched across whole districts, whose decisions bound entire neighborhoods. They wore special robes. They carried staffs. They spoke with the confidence of men who believed the gods themselves had chosen them. Religion, always close to the surface of Mesopotamian life, deepened in the cities as well. Each city took a particular god as its own patron. In Uruk, the goddess Inanna reigned. She was fierce, beautiful, complicated, and completely unpredictable. She was the goddess of love, but also the goddess of war. She was the morning star and the evening star. Dawn and dusk, tenderness and rage all bound together in one shining figure. Her temple stood at the heart of the city, and her festivals filled the streets with music, procession, dance, and drama. During her sacred rites, priestesses of extraordinary status performed rituals that bound the fertility of the fields and the herds to the favour of the goddess. Kings, when they eventually rose, would seek to marry themselves symbolically to Inanna, to legitimize their rule by claiming her divine embrace. She was terrifying and adored in equal measure, and in her double nature, the people of Uruk saw the double nature of life itself, its beauty and its brutality inseparable, twined together like the two rivers themselves. Somewhere in this world, at some unknown moment, a man was born whose name would outlive nearly every empire that came after him. His name was Gilgamesh. Whether he was real or half-real or purely legend, we cannot say for certain, but the memory of him would burn so brightly in Mesopotamian imagination that even 1,500 years after his supposed reign, scribes were still copying his story onto fresh tablets, still telling of his adventures, still weeping for his beloved friend Enkidu, still marvelling at his desperate search for immortality across the ends of the world. He was king of Uruk. He was strong beyond measure, proud beyond wisdom, restless, brilliant, tragic, and the story of his life, though it was written down much later, may hold within it the earliest echo of what a king could be: a shepherd of his people, a builder of walls, a restless soul who dared to ask the questions no one else would dare to ask. What comes after death? Is there any way to escape it? And what, in the end, does a human life actually mean? By the time Uruk reached its greatest height, humanity had crossed a threshold from which there was no returning. The village had become the city. The elder had become the priest, and the priest was becoming the king. The token had become the tablet, and the tablet was becoming literature. The wall had become a fortress. The temple had become an empire's beating heart, and beneath it all, the rivers still flowed, indifferent to the ambitions of men, carrying their silt and their floods and their gifts as they had always done. But they were carrying, now, a new kind of world, a world where humans no longer merely lived within nature, but had begun, in their small stubborn way, to shape it. And that world, born in mud and prayer and grain and clay, would never again be undone. There is a moment in the long unfolding of any civilization when the questions of daily life, of bread and water and shelter, are answered well enough that a new kind of question begins to rise in the human heart. It is a quieter question, a stranger one, a question that has no practical answer at all, and yet refuses to be silenced. Why are we here? Who watches over us in the darkness? What lies beyond the last breath? Who spins the flood into fury one year and mercy the next? These are the questions that visit a farmer standing alone in his field at dusk, when the sun bleeds red across the horizon and the wind carries no clear answer. They are the questions that come to a mother sitting beside a sick child in the small hours of the night. They are the questions that rise in every heart, in every century, and they have always demanded some kind of answer. In Mesopotamia, the answer took shape in stone and mud and song. It took shape in the great towers we now call ziggurats, in the trembling smoke of incense, in the whispered names of gods who ruled the winds and the rivers, and above all in the men and women who devoted their lives to standing between the divine and the human. These were the priests. And around them, slowly, one of the most powerful forces in all of human history was being born. To understand how central religion was in early Mesopotamia, you must first release almost every modern idea you have about faith. For these people, the divine was not distant, not abstract, not a private matter tucked away in the corner of one's heart. The gods were as real as the neighbour across the courtyard. They were as present as the wind that stirred the reeds. When the Tigris rose, that was the god's mood. When the barley grew tall, that was the god's blessing. When plague swept through a household, that was the god's wrath, or perhaps his neglect, or perhaps the meddling of some rival spirit whose name only a wise priest could speak. Nothing happened by accident. Nothing was random. Every gust of wind, every crack of thunder, every birth, every death, every dream that came in the night, all of it was a message, a movement, a signal in the ceaseless conversation between heaven and earth. And it was the job of the priests to listen carefully, to interpret honestly, and to keep the conversation flowing. The earliest temples were humble things. A shrine in the corner of a village, a small mud brick room where a stone figure of a god or goddess stood in silent watch. A family would leave offerings there, a handful of dates, a bowl of barley, a cup of beer, a newborn lamb on the day it was weaned. The offerings were not bribes, not exactly. They were gifts, gestures of respect and dependence, the same way a child leaves flowers at the door of a beloved grandparent. But as villages became towns and towns became cities, the shrines began to grow. Their walls climbed higher, their courtyards spread wider, their rooms multiplied, and at last, in the great cities of southern Mesopotamia, the temples rose into something almost unimaginable. They became mountains built by human hands, the ziggurat. If you were to walk across the flat plain of Sumer in the 3rd millennium before our era, you would see them long before you ever reached the walls of a city. They rose above the horizon like great stepped pyramids, tiered platforms of baked and unbaked brick, ascending toward the sky in gentle terraces. At the top of each ziggurat sat a small temple, the true dwelling place of the god. Broad staircases climbed the flanks so that priests could ascend, step by step, closer to the heavens with each landing. The word ziggurat itself is thought to come from a Mesopotamian word, meaning to rise high, and rise high they did. The great ziggurat of Ur, built in the 21st century before our era, still stands in ruined majesty today, its lowest terraces restored, its ancient bricks bearing the fingerprints of workers whose bones have long since returned to dust. To the people of Ur, this ziggurat was not just a building. It was a bridge. It was the sacred mountain, the axis of the world, the meeting place between what lay above and what lay below. Nowhere in the world had humans built anything like it before. But the ziggurat was only the visible skin of something much deeper. Inside the temple complex at the summit, and in the many rooms and courtyards below, a life of extraordinary devotion unfolded every single day. At dawn, priests bathed the sacred statue of the god, gently washing it with water perfumed by oils, dressing it in fine linen and jewels, arranging its ornaments with the same care a mother might use in dressing her child for a wedding. Meals were prepared and set before the statue 3 times each day. Bread, beer, meat, sweet cakes. Fresh fruit in season. Musicians played harps and lyres in the courtyards. Singers chanted hymns of praise, some of them so ancient that even the priests themselves no longer fully understood every word. Incense burned. Doors were opened and closed with ceremony. Nothing was casual. Nothing was rushed. Because to these people, the god was not a symbol in the temple. The god actually lived there. The god ate that bread. The god drank that beer. The god heard that music. And if the god was neglected, even for a single day, the consequences could be catastrophic. There were many gods, and each had a personality as vivid as any human character in any story ever written. At the summit of the pantheon sat An, or Anu. in the later Akkadian form, the father of the sky, distant, remote, majestic, he was rarely worshipped directly by ordinary people, for he was too high, too vast, too far above the daily struggles of the plains. Beneath him came Enlil, lord of the winds and the storms, the great decider of destinies. It was Enlil who, according to Mesopotamian myth, held the tablet of fates upon which the future of every living thing was written. When Enlil grew angry, the wind rose. When Enlil was pleased, the rains came gently and the harvest was full. He was terrifying and essential in equal measure. Then there was Enki, the god of the sweet waters, the god of wisdom, the god of cleverness and invention. If Enlil was thunder, Enki was the whisper of a hidden spring in the desert. He was the god who, when the other gods grew tired of doing their own labour, had shaped humans from clay to serve them. He was the trickster, the friend of humanity, the god who bent the rules when kindness required it. In the myths, when Enlil once decided to destroy all humans with a great flood, it was Enki who warned a chosen man in secret, told him to build a boat, told him to save his family and the animals of the world. The story is astonishing, because it was written down more than 1,000 years before the biblical flood story, and the resemblance is unmistakable. The ark, the flood, the raven and the dove sent out from the boat, the sacrifice offered when at last the waters receded. These are Mesopotamian bones beneath a later skin. When you read the story of Noah, you are hearing an echo of stories first told beside the Tigris and the Euphrates. And then there was Inanna, the great goddess of Uruk, whose complexity has no easy comparison in later religions. She was young and fierce, tender and violent, seductive and warlike. She was the morning star and the evening star. She was the patron of lovers and the patron of soldiers. Her temples rang with celebration and with lamentation. Her festivals were among the most dramatic and passionate of the Mesopotamian year. And in one of the oldest surviving myths in all of human literature, Inanna descended into the underworld to visit her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the dead. She passed through 7 gates, and at each gate she was required to remove one item of clothing or adornment, arriving at last before her sister naked and stripped of power. She was killed there, hung on a hook like a piece of meat, and only through the cleverness of Enki was she rescued and returned to the world of the living. But something had to take her place. Someone had to remain in the underworld in her stead. And so her lover Dumuzi, who had not properly mourned her, was taken down instead. Every year, when the summer heat scorched the land and the crops withered, the Mesopotamians said it was because Dumuzi was in the underworld, and the goddess wept for him. And every year, when the rains returned and the fields greened again, they said it was because Dumuzi had returned. It is one of the oldest myths of death and rebirth in all human memory, and its echoes can be heard in the stories of Persephone, of Adonis, of Osiris, and in every ancient tale where love reaches down into the darkness and pulls something living back into the light. But it was not only in temples and myths that religion lived. It lived in the small altars kept in every household, where a family might pour a little beer or lay a handful of grain before a small carved figure of an ancestor or a household god. It lived in the amulets worn around the necks of children to ward off illness. It lived in the whispered blessings spoken over a bride before her wedding, and in the wailing songs sung over a body being carried to the grave. It lived in the sky itself, for the Mesopotamians were among the first great watchers of the heavens. They knew that the moon changed shape each month. They knew that certain stars rose at certain times of year. They knew that the planet we call Venus wandered strangely across the sky, sometimes appearing at dawn, sometimes at dusk. They believed that the movements of the stars and planets were the movements of the gods themselves, and by watching them carefully, they could read the future written in the heavens. This was the birth of astrology, and it was also, quietly, the birth of astronomy. For in their patient generation after generation observations of the sky, the priests of Mesopotamia laid the foundations upon which every later astronomer, from ancient Greece to the modern age, would stand. The priests also became the first great custodians of writing. Because they needed to keep temple records, to track offerings, to catalogue gifts, to note the movements of stars, to preserve hymns and prayers, they filled great archives with clay tablets. Some of these archives have survived to this day, buried under the sand of ruined cities. When modern scholars first uncovered them in the 19th century, they held in their hands the actual words of men who had lived 4,000 years before them. Prayers to gods no longer worshipped. Complaints about lazy apprentices. Love poems whispered between people whose names would otherwise have been lost forever. Recipes for beer. Recipes for medicine. Instructions for how to interpret the pattern of oil poured onto water. Descriptions of dreams and what they meant. All of it kept, patiently, in the storerooms of temples by priests who could not have imagined that thousands of years later, strangers from lands they had never heard of would bend over their tablets, squinting in electric light, trying to hear their voices. The temple, in the end, was not only a house of gods, it was a house of memory. And in that house, buried among the whispers of prayer and the wafts of incense, humanity kept its first great record of itself, its hopes, its fears, its questions, its unshakable belief that even in a world of flood and drought and death, there was some order, some meaning, some listening presence just beyond the veil of the visible. And whether we still believe as they did or not, we have never truly stopped asking their questions. The priests of ancient Mesopotamia would recognize the searching in our own hearts. They would nod quietly. They would understand. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a city just before dawn. The bakers have not yet lit their ovens. The dogs have finally exhausted themselves and lie curled in doorways. Even the priests have not yet begun their morning rites. In this pale hush, the walls of an ancient Sumerian city would have stood dark against the sky, and above them the last few stars would still have been holding on, refusing to fade. If you had lived in one of these cities 4,500 years before our own time, you might have wondered, in that quiet moment, who exactly held it all together. Who ensured that the canals were dug in time? Who decided which farmer had rights to which channel of water? Who settled the quarrels between neighbours before knives were drawn? Who summoned warriors when raiders were seen approaching from the north? Who spoke when the whole community had to speak with one voice? In the earliest days of Mesopotamian city life, the answer had been the priesthood and the councils of respected elders. But as the cities grew, and as their fields spread, and as the dangers multiplied, another kind of figure began, slowly and almost reluctantly at first, to step forward. He carried a staff. He wore a robe of finer wool than most. His name was inscribed on tablets and stamped on royal seals. He would come to be called the king. It is important to understand that in Mesopotamia, the king did not simply appear one day, crowned and enthroned. Kingship, as an institution, evolved slowly out of necessity. In the earliest cities, when there was a crisis, whether a flood or a war or a famine, the community would choose a man to lead them through it. When the crisis passed, he would set down his authority and return to his ordinary life. He was called a lugal, which in the Sumerian language meant simply the big man. He was not a monarch. He was not a divine figure. He was a temporary leader, chosen for a season, respected for his strength or his wisdom, and released when his usefulness had ended. But as the cities grew larger and their problems more complex, and as warfare with neighbouring cities became more frequent, these temporary leaders began to hold their positions longer. And longer, until, quietly, one generation blurred into another, and the big man of one year became the big man of the next. And eventually the big man began to speak of his son as the next big man. And so kingship, without anyone quite deciding it, was born. The transition was not smooth, and it was not universally welcomed. There is a famous Sumerian document, later known as the Sumerian King List, in which scribes tried to record all the kings who had ever ruled from the moment kingship, as they said, descended from heaven. In its pages, some kings are said to have reigned for tens of thousands of years, others for merely a few. It is a mixture of memory and myth, a genealogy of power stretching back into a past too distant to verify. But what is striking about it is the phrase kingship descended from heaven. To the Mesopotamians, kingship was not a human invention, it was a divine gift. The gods themselves, they believed, had lowered it down from the sky, placing it first in one city and then, when that city fell into disfavour, moving it to another. This was a powerful and dangerous idea. It meant that a king was not merely a man, he was the chosen instrument of the gods. To defy him was, in a sense, to defy heaven itself, and yet, at the same time, kingship could be taken away. A king who failed his people, whose city fell to enemies, whose crops withered under drought, was clearly a king who had lost the favour of the gods, and the gods, being what they were, might well decide to give kingship to someone new. Warfare shaped the rise of these first kings more than almost anything else. In the earliest centuries of Sumerian civilization, cities had generally lived in a kind of prickly coexistence with each other. There were arguments, of course, border disputes, quarrels over canals, occasional raids to steal cattle or grain, but full-scale war between cities, war intended not merely to punish but to conquer, was still relatively rare. As the population grew and the fields expanded, this began to change. The rich soil of southern Mesopotamia was finite. The waters of the two rivers were finite. When a new canal was dug by one city, another city downstream might find its own fields drying out. When one city expanded its herds, the pasture lands of a neighbour might be encroached upon. Tensions grew sharper, skirmishes became battles, and eventually cities began to build armies, not just militias called up in emergencies, but standing bodies of trained fighting men who lived by the sword and answered to the king. There is a famous piece of stone, carved in fragments and now preserved in the Louvre in Paris, known as the Stele of the Vultures. It comes from the city of Lagash, and it dates to around 2,500 years before our own era. It commemorates a victory of the king Enetum over the rival city of Umma in a long-running dispute over irrigation rights. On one side of the stele, the god Ningirsu himself is depicted holding the enemies of Lagash in a great net, while smashing their heads with a mace. On the other side, the king Enetum leads his troops in tight, orderly ranks, spears bristling, helmets gleaming, marching across the fallen bodies of the defeated. The vultures for which the stele is named are shown flying above the corpses, carrying away the heads and arms of the dead. It is a brutal, unambiguous image. It says, very plainly, that the king is the chosen of the gods, that his enemies are the enemies of the gods, and that no mercy was shown, nor should be expected. It is also, in a way, one of the first pieces of political propaganda in all of human history. It was not made to be a private memento, it was made to be seen. It was made to remind everyone, both citizen and stranger, that the king of Lagash was not a man to be crossed. By the time such stelae were being carved, the shape of Mesopotamian society had settled into something recognizable and enduring. At the very top stood the king and his royal household, surrounded by close advisors, generals, priests and scribes. Just below him stood the priesthood of the great temples, who often owned enormous estates of land and controlled significant portions of the economy. Then came a class of high officials, scribes and administrators who kept the machinery of the state running, along with wealthy merchants whose caravans reached to distant lands. Beneath them stood the great mass of craftsmen and artisans, respected for their skills but generally not wealthy. Then came the farmers, the backbone of the entire civilization, whose labour fed everyone else. And finally, at the very bottom, stood the slaves, mostly captives taken in war, or debtors unable to repay what they owed, or the children of slaves born into bondage. Slavery in Mesopotamia was not, thankfully, on the scale it would later reach in some other civilizations. Slaves had certain legal rights. They could sometimes buy their freedom. They could marry free persons. But they were, nonetheless, considered property, and their lives were rarely their own. Women in this world occupied a complicated place. In the earliest Sumerian society, women appear to have held considerable status. They could own property, they could run businesses, They could inherit. They could serve as priestesses of the highest rank, some of whom, in cities like were the daughters of kings themselves and held enormous political influence. The famous Enheduanna, high priestess of the moon god at in the 23rd century before our era, was the daughter of King Sargon of Akkad, and she composed hymns of such poetic beauty that they are still studied today. She is, in fact, the earliest named author whose work we can still read. A woman, writing more than 4,000 years ago. In cuneiform, on clay tablets, under the shadow of a ziggurat. When we say that Mesopotamia was the beginning of civilization, we sometimes forget that among the very first individual voices in that civilization was the voice of a priestess whose poems are still, incredibly, on our shelves. But even Enheduanna's world was one in which the boundaries around women's lives were often sharply drawn. Ordinary women worked in fields and workshops, wove textiles, raised children, brewed beer, and managed households, but they generally could not hold public office, could not command armies, and were subject to strict laws regarding marriage and sexuality. Later, as centuries passed and the region moved from Sumerian to Akkadian to Babylonian and beyond, the position of women often narrowed further. But it was never a simple picture. There were always exceptions. There were always women whose intelligence, faith, wealth, or sheer stubbornness carried them past the borders that convention had drawn. And through all of this, the king remained the central figure. In the great palaces that began to rise beside the temples, kings held court. They received foreign envoys bringing tribute of gold, ivory, timber, and precious stones. They dispensed judgment on cases too important for lesser officials. They led armies personally into battle, at least in the early days, and later commanded them from behind through generals of proven skill. They ordered the construction of vast irrigation projects that transformed the landscape. They rebuilt temples that had fallen into ruin. They ensured that offerings continued to be made to the gods of their city, for a city that neglected its gods, they believed, would not long remain a city at all. Perhaps the most extraordinary of these early kings was a man whose name has come down to us, wrapped in equal parts history and legend. Sargon of Akkad. He was not, as far as we can tell, a Sumerian by birth. He spoke a different language, a Semitic tongue that his people called Akkadian, which was as different from Sumerian as English is from Chinese. His origins, according to the story he himself later told, were humble to the point of mythical. He said his mother had been a priestess who, forbidden to bear a child, secretly gave birth to him and placed him in a basket of reeds sealed with pitch, setting him afloat on the Euphrates River. He was rescued, the story says, by a gardener named Aki, who raised him as his own son. In time, the young Sargon rose to become the cupbearer of the king of Kish, one of the most powerful cities of the north. And from that position, through means we can only guess at, he overthrew his master and seized the throne himself. If the story sounds familiar to you, it should. Nearly 2,000 years later, the story of Moses would be told in strikingly similar terms. A baby Set, adrift in a basket of reeds, rescued from the water, raised in obscurity, destined to become a leader of nations. It is one of the deep, recurring shapes of the human imagination. And in Sargon's case, whether the details are fact or legend, what came next was undeniably real. He conquered. And he conquered. And he conquered some more, not just his immediate neighbours, but city after city, until he had done something no ruler before him had ever done. He had united nearly all of Mesopotamia under a single crown. The old world of independent city-states, each with its own king, its own gods, its own quarrels, was over. In its place stood something entirely new. An empire. The moment when Sargon of Akkad stood atop the walls of a conquered Sumerian city and gazed out over lands that now answered to him alone, humanity crossed a threshold as significant, in its own way, as the moment when the first seeds had been pressed into the earth. Before Sargon, the world had known cities. It had known kings. It had known armies. But it had never truly known an empire. The idea that a single ruler, from a single throne, could hold sway over dozens of cities, over hundreds of thousands of people, over lands where different languages were spoken and different gods were worshipped. This was something entirely new. And once the idea had taken root in human imagination, it would never leave. Every emperor of Persia, every pharaoh of the New Kingdom, every Caesar of Rome, every Khan of the steppes, every Sultan of Istanbul, every colonial ruler of every later century walked, whether they knew it or not, in the footsteps of a man who had been set adrift as a baby in a basket of reeds on the Euphrates. Sargon founded his capital at a city called Akkad, and its exact location remains, remarkably one of the great unsolved mysteries of archaeology. We know it existed. We have countless references to it in later tablets. We know it was somewhere along the Tigris or the Euphrates, probably not far from where Baghdad stands today. But its ruins have never been found. It is as though the city that gave its name to an entire language, an entire empire, an entire era of Mesopotamian history has slipped through our fingers and hidden itself beneath the earth. Perhaps someday a farmer's plough will turn up something extraordinary. Perhaps a satellite scan will detect the outline of walls beneath fields that have been sown and harvested for thousands of years. Until then, Akkad remains a name without a place, a memory without a body, a whisper carried down the corridors of time. But if we cannot walk its streets, we can still trace its influence. Sargon's empire stretched, at its greatest extent, from the Persian Gulf to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the mountains of what is now western Iran to the plateaus of central Anatolia. In his own inscriptions, he boasted that he had washed his weapons in both the Upper Sea and the Lower Sea, which is to say the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf. This was not empty boasting. His armies really did march that far. His trade caravans really did move goods across those distances. Merchants from Akkad appeared in ports where no Mesopotamian had been seen before. Silver from the mountains of Anatolia, copper from the deposits of Oman, timber from the cedars of Lebanon, all of it flowed toward the treasuries of Akkad. And in return, Akkadian textiles, Akkadian grain, Akkadian pottery, Akkadian bronze, and above all, Akkadian influence flowed outward across the ancient world. To hold such a vast domain together, Sargon had to invent, or refine, techniques of rule that had never been necessary in a single city. He replaced local rulers in conquered cities with governors of his own choosing, often men from his own family, or trusted commanders who had proven themselves loyal in war. He standardized weights and measures across the empire, so that a shekel in Ur was the same as a shekel in Akkad, and a measure of barley in Nippur was the same as a measure of barley in Kish. He built a network of roads and messenger stations so that news and orders could travel across his realm with unprecedented speed. He imposed his language, Akkadian, as the language of administration, though Sumerian continued to be used in temple ritual and scholarly texts. The empire became, in effect, bilingual, and in that bilingualism, Sumerian became something like Latin would later be in medieval Europe. A prestigious, sacred language, no longer spoken in the streets but still used by scribes and priests, still copied by students, still guarded as the vessel of ancient wisdom. Religion, too, was harnessed to the needs of empire. Sargon did not attempt to overthrow the old Sumerian gods. He honoured them. He rebuilt their temples. He made offerings to them. But he also elevated his own patron goddess, Ishtar, who was in many ways the Akkadian version of Inanna, to a position of extraordinary prominence. It was said that Ishtar herself had chosen him, had loved him, had led him to victory in every battle. When Sargon spoke of his conquests, he spoke of them as the will of Ishtar, and no one in his empire could safely dispute it. Religion and politics fused, as they always tend to fuse when great powers are at their height. To resist the king was not merely rebellion, it was blasphemy. Sargon reigned, according to the ancient sources, for 56 years. Whether the number is exact or slightly exaggerated hardly matters. What matters is that he ruled for so long that an entire generation was born, grew up, married, had children of their own, and grew old, all under the same king. Stability of that kind, in a world where kings had once reigned only for a season, was itself a revolution. When at last he died, sometime around the year 2279 before our own era, he passed his empire on to his sons, and though they struggled with rebellions, they held the empire together. The dynasty he founded endured for more than 100 years, and its greatest king, after Sargon himself, was his own grandson, a man named Naram-Sin. Naram-Sin, whose name meant beloved of the moon god, took his grandfather's empire and pushed it further than ever before. His armies marched into the highlands of what is now Iran. They pressed westward into Syria. They crossed mountain ranges that no Mesopotamian army had crossed before, and with each victory, Naram-Sin grew bolder, more grand, more certain of his own greatness. There survives, in the Louvre in Paris, an extraordinary monument known as the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin. It shows the king climbing a mountain at the head of his army, striding upward with an expression of serene confidence, wearing on his head a helmet crowned with the horns that in Mesopotamian art marked a figure as a god. This is the astonishing thing. Naram-Sin declared himself a god, not merely the chosen of the gods, not merely the servant of the gods, a god himself, divine to be worshipped, to be prayed to be honoured with offerings alongside the ancient deities of Sumer and Akkad. It was an audacity that would have been unthinkable in the days of the earliest kings, when a Lugal was merely a temporary big man chosen in a crisis. For a time, it seemed to work. The empire flourished, the treasuries filled, the temples rose. But hubris, in Mesopotamian memory, always brought its price. Later scribes would tell a story, half history and half moral fable, about how Naram-Sin in his arrogance had angered the gods. In one version, he was said to have sacked the sacred city of Nippur, the great religious centre of Sumer, an act so sacrilegious that even the earth itself trembled at the news. The god Enlil, offended beyond measure, was said to have summoned barbarians from the mountains, a savage people called the Gutians, to come down and punish the pride of Akkad. Whether or not the Gutians were actually summoned by an angry god, they certainly came. Descending from the Zagros mountains in wave after wave, they raided the northern provinces of the empire. Cities burned, canals fell into disrepair, grain became scarce. Rebellions broke out among cities that had long resented Akkadian rule. And within a generation of Naram-Sin's death, the empire that Sargon had built began to unravel. By around 2150 before our era, the great empire of Akkad had collapsed. Its capital was abandoned or destroyed, or perhaps simply drained of its population as people fled the chaos. The Gutians, whose culture the Sumerians and Akkadians considered rough and barbaric, took control of much of Mesopotamia, though their rule was loose, disorganized, and by all later accounts. Disastrous Sumerian scribes writing decades later remembered the Gutian period as a time when nobody was king, when the fields lay untended, when the canals silted up, when brothers no longer trusted brothers, and when the temples of the great gods stood empty and cold. Whether reality was quite that bleak is uncertain, but it is telling that in the memory of those who came after. The fall of Akkad was remembered as a wound, a rupture, a fall from grace. And yet, as with so many things in Mesopotamian history, decline was not the end. It was, as always, a pause, a breath, a gathering of new forces beneath the surface. Slowly, city by city, southern Mesopotamia began to reassert itself. In the ancient city of Lagash, a ruler named Gudea emerged in the late 22nd century before our era. He was not a conqueror in the mould of Sargon or Naram-Sin. He did not lead great armies across mountains. Instead, he devoted himself to peace, to piety, to the rebuilding of temples, to the honouring of the gods, to the beautification of his city. Statues of Gudea have survived in remarkable numbers, some of them carved from diorite, a stone so hard it would have taken enormous patience to shape. In these statues, Gudea sits with his hands folded in his lap, wearing a simple wool cap, his expression calm and thoughtful. He does not look like a warrior. He looks like a wise man, a man who understood that after the earthquake of empire, what his people needed most was gentleness. And then, a few decades later, came the Great Restoration. In the city of Ur, a king named Ur-Nammu rose to power around the year 2112 before our era. He was a man of enormous energy and ambition, and he set about doing what no ruler had done in a century. He reunified southern Mesopotamia. He drove out the last remnants of the Gutian invaders. He rebuilt the great cities of Sumer. He restored the temples that had fallen into ruin. And most magnificently, he built the great ziggurat of Ur, that towering stepped monument whose reconstructed base still rises out of the desert today, one of the most iconic images of the ancient Near East. Ur-Nammu founded what historians now call the Third Dynasty of Ur, and under his rule and the rule of his son Shulgi, southern Mesopotamia experienced a golden age. Ur-Nammu is also remembered for something even more remarkable than his ziggurat. He is credited with the earliest known written law code in human history. Long before Hammurabi carved his famous laws into black basalt, Ur-Nammu had already set down, in Sumerian, a collection of laws intended to govern his kingdom. The code has come down to us only in fragments, but even those fragments are astonishing. Unlike the harsh eye for an eye retributive style that would later dominate Mesopotamian law, Ur-Nammu's code often preferred fines and monetary compensation. A man who struck another might be required to pay silver, not lose his hand. A man who defamed his neighbour might owe a set fee. The code sought balance, restoration, the mending of the social fabric rather than simple vengeance. Its opening lines declared that Ur-Nammu had been chosen by the gods to establish justice in the land, to protect the widow from the powerful, to protect the poor from the rich, to ensure that no orphan would be forgotten and no weak person crushed. These are astonishing words. They are words that any ruler in any century might still profitably remember. And they were written patiently on wet clay more than 4,000 years ago by a king who understood that no empire could endure without justice at its heart. His son Shulgi went further still. He standardized weights and measures across the kingdom. He reformed the calendar. He built roads with rest houses every day's journey apart, so that travellers and messengers could move safely across the realm. He organised the bureaucracy with such precision that tens of thousands of tablets survive from his reign, recording everything from the delivery of a single sheep to the great temple to the ration of beer given to a workman on a distant construction site. And, following the example of Naram-Sin, he also declared himself divine. In hymns composed during his lifetime, Shulgi was praised as a god who could run from Ur to Nippur and back in a single day. Whether he actually did such a thing is beside the point. His people believed it, or at least chose to sing it, and that was enough. Under Shulgi, the memory of Sargon's empire lived again, softened now by law, refined by administration, blessed by ceremony. But no golden age lasts forever, and even as Shulgi's Ur gleamed brightly upon the plain of Sumer, new forces were beginning to gather on the horizon, quiet as clouds, patient as the wind, waiting for their moment to come. The end of the Third Dynasty of Ur did not come with a single thunderous collapse. It came the way many great civilizations end, gradually, quietly, from 1,000 small cracks that no one noticed until the wall was already falling. Under Shulgi, the kingdom had gleamed like burnished copper in the sun. His successors, Amar-Sin, Shu-Sin, and finally Ibi-Sin, inherited a machinery of state so refined, so ordered, so full of promise that no one could have imagined its end. But even the finest machinery cannot run forever without maintenance, and the pressures that had been building beneath the surface of Sumerian civilization for generations were finally beginning to crack it open. The first pressure was environmental, though the people of the time would not have described it in such modern terms. For centuries, the canals of southern Mesopotamia had been carrying water from the great rivers into fields that stretched farther and farther across the plain. But this water, drawn again and again from the same sources, carried with it small amounts of dissolved salt. As it evaporated under the fierce summer sun, the salt remained behind in the soil. Slowly, generation after generation, the fields grew saltier. Wheat, which cannot tolerate salt well, began to fail. Farmers switched to barley, which was more forgiving, but even barley began to yield less. By the final years of the third dynasty of Ur, once fertile fields were turning white with salt crusts, and the harvests were shrinking. The engine of Sumerian civilization, the grain surplus that had made everything possible, was quietly running out of fuel. The second pressure was human. To the west, in the deserts of Syria and along the fringes of Mesopotamia, semi-nomadic peoples known as the Amorites had been drifting eastward for generations. They spoke a Semitic language related to Akkadian, and they lived in tents, herding sheep and goats across lands the settled Sumerians considered wild and dangerous. The Sumerians called them the Martu, and in their writings they were often described with the mixture of contempt and fear that settled civilizations have always reserved for the peoples of the frontier. They ate their meat uncooked, said the Sumerian scribes. They did not bury their dead. They did not know houses. They did not know grain. These descriptions were, of course, both exaggerated and prejudiced. The Amorites knew perfectly well how to bury their dead and cook their meat, and many of them had been living in and around Sumerian cities for generations, working, trading, marrying, integrating. But their steady influx into the settled lands was creating pressure that the kings of Ur, no matter how efficient their bureaucracy, could not fully absorb. To the east, an even more direct threat was rising. In the mountains of what is now western Iran, the ancient kingdom of Elam had watched with growing envy the wealth of Sumer. The Elamites were an ancient people themselves, with their own cities, their own language, their own gods. They had traded with Mesopotamia for centuries, sometimes as partners, sometimes as rivals, and in the reign of Ibbi-Sin, the last king of the third dynasty of Ur, they saw their opportunity. Ibbi-Sin was, by all accounts, not an incompetent ruler, but he was inheriting a kingdom already sagging under invisible weight, and the crisis of his reign came faster than any king could have handled. The Amorites pressed in from the west, the Elamites gathered in the east. The salt crept across the fields, the harvests failed, prices soared, the great bureaucracy that had counted every sheep and every jar of oil under Shulgi began to break down. Governors of distant cities, receiving fewer supplies and less support from the capital, began to act on their own authority. Some declared independence. One provincial governor, a man named Ishbi-Era, whom Ibbi-Sin had trusted to secure grain from a distant city, wrote back to the king with news that seemed innocent enough on the surface, that he had gathered the grain but was unable to transport it because of the unsettled conditions. Then, quietly, he took that grain and used it to feed his own growing power. Within a few years, Ishbi-Era had founded his own kingdom in the city of Isin, taking with him the loyalty of much of what remained of Ur's authority in the north. Ibbi-Sin watched his empire dissolve around him. The tablets from his reign preserve a kind of quiet desperation. Letters written to allies begging for help. Records of prices climbing so fast that a single measure of barley cost 30 times what it had cost a generation before. Reports of cities lost. Reports of governors turning traitor. And through it all, the king sat in his palace at Ur, watching the walls of his world crumble. The final blow came around the year 2004, before our own era. The Elamites, sensing that Ur was no longer capable of defending itself, marched down from the mountains with an army. They swept across the plain. They crossed the walls of the city. And they did what no one, in the long memory of Sumer, had ever quite done before. They took Ur. They sacked its palaces. They plundered its temples. They dragged Ibbi-Sin, the last king of the third dynasty, away in chains into captivity in Elam, where he vanishes from history. And they left the great ziggurat of Ur once the shining wonder of the Sumerian world, standing above a ruined city. The lamentation that survives from this period is one of the most heartbreaking documents in all of ancient literature. Sumerian scribes, writing not many years after the disaster, composed a series of poems that we now call the Lamentation over the destruction of Ur. In it, the goddess Ningal, the divine wife of the moon god Nanna, patron of Ur, weeps for her fallen city. She wanders through its empty streets. She mourns the temples that lie broken open. She grieves for the priests who have been killed. She calls out to the great gods, asking why they abandoned her city, why they allowed such destruction, why they turned their faces away. It is poetry of such raw, aching sorrow that it is almost impossible to read without feeling that the scribe who wrote it must have witnessed the ruin with his own eyes. In its lines, the fall of Ur is not merely a political event. It is a cosmic tragedy. It is a rupture in the fabric of the world. And in a very real sense, it was. Because with the fall of Ur, the great age of Sumerian civilization, the age that had begun with the first mud-brick shrine at Eridu thousands of years earlier, came to an end. Sumerian would still be studied by scribes for centuries afterward, preserved as a sacred and scholarly language, much as Latin would later be preserved in medieval Europe, but it would no longer be the living tongue of a living people. The Sumerians, as a distinct people, dissolved into the wider Mesopotamian population, their language becoming a whisper in the mouths of priests, their memory becoming a legend on the tablets of later scribes. Yet Mesopotamian civilization itself did not die with Sumer. Nothing so essential could die so easily. The rivers still flowed, the fields, though damaged, could still be worked, the cities, though sacked, could be rebuilt. And into the void left by years' collapse, new powers began to rise. The Amorites, once the wild men of the desert, now began to establish themselves as rulers of Mesopotamian cities. They had been coming for generations, and they knew the land, they knew the language, they knew the gods. In city after city, Amorite chieftains took the throne, calling themselves by Mesopotamian titles, worshipping Mesopotamian deities, building Mesopotamian temples. And one of the many small cities where this happened, a city that in earlier centuries had been of almost no significance at all, was a place called Babylon. Babylon sat on the middle stretch of the Euphrates, in a region that had never been particularly important. It had no great ziggurat. It had no famous temple. It had no distinguished history. It was, in the days of the third dynasty of Ur, the kind of provincial town that a traveller might pass through without pausing. Its patron god, Marduk, was a minor deity, barely worth mentioning in the great pantheon of Sumerian gods. And yet, in one of those quiet twists of history that no one at the time could have predicted, Babylon was about to become the beating heart of the entire Mesopotamian world. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly, across more than 1,000 years, this obscure little town would rise to become the greatest city on earth, then fall, then rise again, then fall again, until its very name would become a byword for civilization, and its fall a symbol used by prophets and poets forever after. The man who lifted Babylon out of obscurity was, at first, indistinguishable from a dozen other Amorite chieftains ruling small cities across Mesopotamia in the early 2nd millennium before our era. His name was Sumu Abum, and around the year 1900 before our era, he founded what would become the first dynasty of Babylon. For nearly a century after him, the kings of Babylon were minor figures, competing with rival kingdoms in Larsa, Isin, Eshnunna, and Mari. Babylon in those days was one small kingdom among many, respectable but hardly dominant. But the 6th king of this dynasty, who came to the throne around the year 1792 before our era, would change all of that. His name was Hammurabi. Hammurabi did not begin his reign as a great conqueror. In fact, for the first 30 years or so of his rule, he was mostly a careful, patient administrator. He improved the canal systems around Babylon. He built temples. He honoured the gods. He fortified his cities. He negotiated with his rivals, entering into alliances with some, keeping careful watch on others. To an observer at the time, He might have seemed cautious, even timid. But beneath the caution, a mind of extraordinary strategic patience was at work. He was watching, he was waiting, he was learning the weaknesses of every neighbour, every rival, every ally. And then, in the 29th year of his reign, Hammurabi began to move. In a series of campaigns that seemed to unfold almost effortlessly, he defeated Elam. He conquered Larsa. He absorbed Eshnunna. He turned on his old ally, Mari, one of the great cities of the Euphrates, and destroyed it so thoroughly that its palaces have only been rediscovered in the modern era. By the end of his reign, Hammurabi ruled almost all of Mesopotamia, from the Persian Gulf in the south to the borders of Assyria in the north. Babylon, the once obscure provincial town, had become the capital of an empire, but it is not for his conquests that Hammurabi is chiefly remembered. Conquerors, after all, come and go. What Hammurabi left behind was something that outlasted his armies, outlasted his empire, outlasted even his memory. It was a great stone pillar, more than 2 meters tall, carved from black diorite, its surface densely covered in cuneiform inscriptions. Today it stands in the Louvre in Paris, one of the most precious objects in any museum in the world. It is the Code of Hammurabi. And when we read it, we are hearing, across nearly 4,000 years, the voice of a king who wanted his justice to outlast him. If you were to stand in front of the great stone pillar of Hammurabi today, in the quiet marble halls of the Louvre in Paris, you would first notice its colour. It is black, deep and glossy, carved from a stone called diorite, one of the hardest materials the ancient world could work. At the top of the pillar, in a beautifully preserved carving, you would see 2 figures. On the right sits a god, seated on a throne, wearing a horned crown, holding out toward the second figure a rod and a ring, ancient symbols of authority. On the left stands the king, Hammurabi himself, respectful but confident, his hand raised in a gesture of greeting or reverence. The god is Shamash, the sun god and the god of justice, the deity who was believed to see all things because his light touched all things. And in this carved scene, Shamash is handing to Hammurabi the authority to make and enforce law. It is one of the most eloquent political images ever created. It says without a single word that the laws that follow below are not merely the ideas of a man. They are the will of the divine, entrusted to a king who is himself the servant of a higher order. Below this scene, the pillar is covered with tightly packed cuneiform script. Nearly 300 laws in all, written in Akkadian, the common language of the empire, so that any literate person could read them. And here is one of the most extraordinary things about the Code of Hammurabi. It was not hidden away in a palace archive. It was not kept only in the possession of judges. It was displayed publicly, in a place where anyone who passed by could see it. A merchant returning from a distant journey. A widow uncertain of her rights. A farmer worried about his boundaries. A slave wondering whether his master could really beat him without limit. Any of them could stand before the pillar, and if they could not read, ask a passing scribe to read it aloud to them. In an age when so much of law had been the private knowledge of priests and kings, this was, in its own quiet way, a revolution. The laws themselves are a strange and vivid window into the world Hammurabi ruled. They cover almost everything. Property rights, marriage, divorce, inheritance, business contracts, loans and interest rates, wages for labourers, fees for physicians, rules for surgeons and boat builders, regulations for the tavern keepers who brewed and sold beer, rules about slaves, rules about the treatment of concubines, rules about the responsibilities of shepherds, rules about what happens when a wall falls down and injures someone, rules about what happens when a boat sinks, rules about false accusations, about oaths sworn in temples, about theft, about murder, about adultery, about kidnapping. Reading them today is like walking through the streets of Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago, hearing the voices of ordinary people, seeing their quarrels, understanding their fears. The most famous principle of Hammurabi's code is the one we now call lex talionis, the law of retaliation. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. If a man breaks the bone of another man, they shall break his bone. If a builder builds a house so badly that it collapses and kills the owner's son, then the builder's son shall be put to death. These laws sound harsh to modern ears, and they were harsh. But they were also, in their own way, an attempt to bring proportion into justice. Before written codes, punishments were often unpredictable, depending on the mood of a judge or the wealth of the accused. The principle of an eye for an eye may sound brutal, but it also set a limit. It said, in effect, that you could not take a life for a stolen coin, or destroy a family for a single insult. The punishment could not exceed the crime. But here is where the Code of Hammurabi shows both its ambition and its limitations. Its justice was not equal. It varied sharply according to the social status of the persons involved. Mesopotamian society was divided into three broad classes. There were the free men of high status, called a oilem. There were the commoners, the meskinum. And there were the slaves, the wardem. If a nobleman injured another nobleman, the principle of retaliation applied strictly. Eye for eye, bone for bone. But if a nobleman injured a commoner, he simply paid a fine, usually in silver. And if a nobleman injured a slave, the penalty was even lighter. The value of a human life in Hammurabi's code depended on where that life stood in the social hierarchy. This was not, by any modern standard, blind justice. It was justice that could see very well, in fact, and knew exactly whom it was looking at. And yet, alongside these hard inequalities, there ran through the Code of Hammurabi a genuine, almost tender concern for the vulnerable. In its opening lines, the king declared that he had been called by the gods to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong might not oppress the weak, and so that the widow and the orphan might have justice. Many of the laws that follow show real effort to make this promise more than empty words. A tenant farmer whose crops were destroyed by flood or storm could not be forced to pay rent for that year. A wife whose husband was taken captive in war and left her without support was permitted to enter another man's household to survive, and could not be punished for it. A woman's dowry, brought with her into marriage, remained her own property, and if she was widowed, her husband's family could not seize it. Children of a slave woman by a free man, if the father had acknowledged them, could not be sold into slavery and gained a share of the inheritance. Even physicians were held accountable. A surgeon whose operation killed a patient of noble rank could lose his hand. A builder whose house collapsed could pay with his life, or the life of a member of his family, depending on who had died. The Code of Hammurabi is not, in the end, a document that any modern legal scholar would call fair. But it is one of the earliest surviving attempts by human beings to write down, with detail and clarity, the rules by which they intended to live together. And its influence would echo far beyond the walls of Babylon. Its concepts of retribution, its concern for widows and orphans, its regulation of contracts and marriages, would seep, in ways sometimes clear and sometimes subterranean, into the legal traditions of the peoples who lived alongside Babylon and inherited its ideas. Elements of the biblical law of ancient Israel, the legal codes of the Hittites and the Assyrians, and eventually even the Roman law that shaped so much of the modern world, all bear distant traces of the pillar that Hammurabi raised in the streets of his city. When you sign a contract today, when you read a lease, when you argue in a court, you are participating in a tradition that stretches back, in some invisible way, to that black stone in a public square in Babylon nearly 4,000 years ago. Hammurabi ruled for a long time, more than 40 years, and during his reign, Babylon reached a height it had never known before. His empire was administered carefully, its canals maintained, its temples honoured, its foreign relations handled through skilled diplomacy. Letters from his court have survived, and in them we can see him personally attending to matters that a modern head of state would never bother with. He wrote to local officials about the digging of a specific canal. He wrote to a governor about the case of a wronged widow. He wrote about the correct treatment of a particular criminal. He was, by all appearances, a king who genuinely believed in the work of ruling, who did not delegate everything to ministers, who kept his eye on the details as much as on the grand design. And he did all of this while managing an empire that had swallowed most of Mesopotamia. But great as Hammurabi was, he could not, in the end, defeat the deepest law of all Mesopotamian history, the law that no empire, however brilliant, endures forever. When he died around the year 1750 before our own era, he left the throne to his son Samsu-iluna, and within a generation the empire began to unravel. Provinces rebelled, frontier peoples pressed inward. The tightly organised bureaucracy Hammurabi had built began to weaken. New peoples appeared on the edges of Mesopotamian civilization, peoples whose names would have meant nothing to Hammurabi in his lifetime. There were the Kassites, coming down from the Zagros Mountains, whose language belonged to no known family and whose origins remain mysterious to this day. There were the Hurrians, spreading across the north. And most dramatically, there were the Hittites, an Indo-European speaking people who had built a powerful kingdom in what is now central Turkey. In the year 1595 before our era, or somewhere close to that date, the Hittites did the unthinkable. Under their king Masili I, they marched down the Euphrates in a great raid, and they sacked Babylon itself. They did not stay. They took their plunder and returned home. But the damage was done. Hammurabi's dynasty, which had ruled for 3 centuries, collapsed in the aftermath of the raid. Into the vacuum came the Kassites, quietly, gradually, until at some point in the murky years after the Hittite raid, they simply were the rulers of Babylon. They would remain in power for nearly 400 years, which is one of the longest continuous dynasties in all of Mesopotamian history. Yet the Kassite period remains one of the least well-known chapters of Babylonian civilization, partly because they were not great builders of monuments, partly because they seem to have deliberately kept a low profile, and partly because much of what they did produce has been lost. What we can say is that under Kassite rule, Babylon endured. Its religion continued, its temples were maintained, its scribes copied the ancient literature of Sumer and Akkad, preserving it for future generations. The Kassites adopted the culture of the land they now ruled, worshipped its gods, learned its language, adopted its ways. And in doing so, they became one more thread in the endless tapestry of Mesopotamian civilization, another people who had come in from outside and been transformed by the land between the rivers. Meanwhile, far to the north, along the upper Tigris River, another city had been growing steadily, patiently, in the shadow of Babylon's fame. It was not particularly beautiful. It did not have famous ziggurats. It did not have poets whose names were sung across the ancient world. But it had something else. It had discipline. It had grit. It had above all an unshakable belief in itself and in its patron god, a deity whose name it also carried. The city was called Ashur, and its people were called Assyrians. And in the centuries after the fall of Hammurabi's dynasty, these Assyrians would begin their slow, methodical rise from a modest commercial city into something the world had never seen before. Not just an empire, not just a great kingdom, a war machine of such organization, such ferocity, such calculated brutality, that the very name of Assyria would come to strike terror across 3 continents. Their rise would be slow, their reach eventually vast, and their fall, when it came at last, would be one of the most sudden and complete collapses in all of ancient history. But that story of Assyria's rise from provincial trading city to master of the known world, of iron and terror and libraries filled with tablets, of kings who flayed their enemies and kings who read philosophy by lamplight, of walls that fell and gods that seemed to abandon their people, that story lies just ahead. The city of Ashur sat on a rocky outcrop overlooking the Tigris River, in a stretch of land that was harder, drier, and less forgiving than the rich alluvial plains of the south. Where Babylon and the older Sumerian cities had grown up in a landscape of soft mud, gentle floods and abundant reeds, Ashur was born of stone and wind. Its people were shaped by that harshness. They were farmers, yes, but they were also merchants, and above all, they were fighters. For long centuries, while the great cities of the south rose and fell, while empires bloomed and withered along the Euphrates, Ashur remained a modest but proud commercial city, quietly building its wealth through trade caravans that reached deep into Anatolia. Its merchants set up trading colonies in distant cities, established networks of credit and exchange, and returned home with silver, tin, and other precious goods. The Assyrians, from their earliest days, understood that wealth could be won not only by the sword, but by the pen and the caravan. But wealth, in the ancient world, always drew envy. And envy, when it came from powerful neighbours, had to be answered with strength. The Assyrians, hemmed in on one side by the mountain peoples of the Zagros, and on the other by rival Mesopotamian powers, learned early that survival required not just cleverness, but hardness. Their kings began, gradually, to organise their people around the discipline of war. Every man of fighting age owed service. Every campaign was expected to bring back plunder, tribute, and above all, glory to the god Ashur, from whom both the city and the people took their name. And in that god, unlike the many-layered pantheons of the south, the Assyrians found something distinct. Ashur was not just one deity among many. Ashur was the state itself, made divine. To fight for Assyria was to fight for Ashur. To expand the borders of Assyria was to expand the domain of the god. Religion and warfare became so tightly woven together that in Assyrian eyes they could not be separated at all. For centuries this fusion of trade, faith and military discipline made Assyria a strong but relatively contained power. Then, in the 14th century before our own era, under a king named Ashur-uballit I, Assyria began to step out onto the wider stage of Near Eastern politics. He corresponded as an equal with the pharaohs of Egypt. He fought successful wars against neighbouring powers. He established Assyria as a kingdom to be reckoned with, not merely as a wealthy trading city. His successors continued the work, campaign after campaign, king after king, until by the 13th century before our era, Assyria had become one of the great powers of the ancient Near East. But even then, it was still just one great power among several. The Hittites in Anatolia, the Egyptians in the Nile Valley, the Kassites in Babylon, the kingdom of Mitanni to the west, all of these were still competing for influence. Assyria had not yet become the terror it would soon become. The true rise of the Assyrian Empire, the rise that would fix its name in human memory forever, came in the 9th century before our era, under a series of kings whose names still evoke both awe and dread. Ashur-unisserpal II was one of the first of them. He inherited a strong kingdom and turned it into a machine of expansion. He campaigned relentlessly. He marched east, north and west, subduing city after city, region after region. And he did something new, something that would become the terrible signature of Assyrian rule for the next 2 centuries. He used calculated terror as a weapon of policy. In his royal inscriptions, Ashur-unisserpal boasted of what he did to cities that resisted him. He impaled their leaders on stakes outside their walls. He flayed nobles alive and hung their skins from the gates of conquered towns. He built pyramids of severed heads. He blinded prisoners. He mutilated survivors. He took children into slavery and deported entire populations from their homelands to distant corners of the empire. These were not the ravings of a madman. These were, in the coldest possible sense, policies. Word of them was spread deliberately, carried by refugees, by merchants, by returning envoys, so that when the Assyrian army next appeared on the horizon of a foreign city, the defenders would already be shaking. Many cities, hearing that army was coming, simply opened their gates and threw themselves on the mercy of the Assyrian king, hoping that swift surrender would spare them the worst. And that was precisely the effect Ashur-unisserpal wanted. Terror was cheaper than siege warfare. Fear conquered where armies would have died. He built a new capital, Kalhu, which the Bible would later call Kala and modern archaeologists know as Nimrud. He filled its palaces with reliefs carved into alabaster, showing him in scenes of hunting, warfare, and ritual. Massive winged bulls with human heads, called lamassu, guarded the gates. Every wall told a story of Assyrian dominance. Every image reminded viewers that this king was not to be defied. Ashurbanipal was, in his own way, a master of political theatre, and his capital was the stage upon which he performed the drama of imperial power. His son, Shalmaneser III, continued the expansion. He pressed westward into Syria, fought a great battle against a coalition of local kings at Karkar in the year 853 before our era, and though the battle itself may have been a draw, the long-term result was the steady absorption of Syrian city-states into the Assyrian sphere. Shalmaneser was also the first Assyrian king to bring the small kingdom of Israel into direct contact with Assyrian power. His famous black obelisk, discovered in the ruins of Nimrud in the 19th century, shows an Israelite king named Jehu bowing before him, offering tribute. It is one of the earliest surviving images we have of a figure named in the Hebrew Bible, and it stands in the British Museum today, a small but astonishing piece of the ancient world made suddenly startlingly real. The Assyrian military machine that these kings commanded was unlike anything the world had ever seen. They developed one of the first true standing professional armies in human history. Where earlier Mesopotamian armies had been made up largely of farmers called up in emergency, Assyria maintained a corps of full-time soldiers year-round, supported by taxes drawn from the entire empire. These soldiers were organised, trained, and equipped with weapons of iron rather than bronze. Iron, harder and cheaper to produce than bronze once smiths learned to work with it, gave Assyrian troops a decisive edge in battle. Their chariots thundered across battlefields. Their cavalry outflanked opposing armies. Their siege engineers built ramps, battering rams, and mobile towers that could break down almost any wall. Their sappers dug tunnels beneath fortifications. Their archers, protected by shield-bearers, rained down volleys of arrows on defenders who had no answer. Perhaps most importantly, the Assyrians created a system of provincial administration that could actually hold together the enormous territories they conquered. Each conquered region was made into a province and placed under a governor appointed directly by the king. These governors were watched carefully, monitored by royal inspectors, and their loyalty tested constantly. A network of royal roads and messenger stations connected the capital to the farthest provinces, so that orders could travel from the king to the borders of the empire in a matter of days, and news of trouble could reach the throne with unprecedented speed. Rebellious populations were often uprooted from their homelands and deported to distant regions, where, cut off from their roots and surrounded by strangers, they were unable to organise resistance. This policy of mass deportation, brutal though it was, gave the Assyrians something that many later empires would struggle to achieve: stability. The greatest and most terrible of the Assyrian kings came in the 8th and 7th centuries before our own era. Tiglath-Pileser III reformed the army, restructured the administration, and expanded the empire far beyond anything his predecessors had achieved. Sargon II, who took his name from the ancient founder of Akkad more than 1,500 years earlier, conquered even more, destroyed the kingdom of Israel in the year 722 before our era, and deported 10 of its 12 tribes into distant lands, where they largely vanished from history and became, in later legend, the lost tribes of Israel. His son Sennacherib turned his fury on the kingdom of Judah, laid siege to Jerusalem, and left an account of it inscribed on a hexagonal clay prism, in which he boasted that he had shut up the Judean king Hezekiah in his royal city like a caged bird. Sennacherib also, in a fit of rage after the Babylonians rebelled against him yet again, ordered his troops to destroy Babylon so completely that it would never rise again. They flooded the ruins with water from the Euphrates and left the city a wasteland. It was one of the great acts of cultural destruction in ancient history, and it shocked even the Assyrians themselves. Sennacherib was later murdered by his own sons and Mesopotamian tradition long remembered his death as divine punishment for the destruction of Babylon. His grandson, Ashurbanipal, who ruled from the year 669 to about 631 before our own era, would be the last great Assyrian king, and he was in many ways the most fascinating of them all. He was, of course, a warrior in the mould of his ancestors. He led armies, he crushed rebellions, he extended the empire briefly to include even parts of Egypt. But Ashurbanipal was also, remarkably, a scholar. He had been trained from childhood in reading and writing cuneiform, in the languages of both Akkadian and the ancient, no longer spoken Sumerian. He read for pleasure, he collected books, he sent agents throughout Mesopotamia with a single mission to gather every clay tablet they could find, and to bring them to his palace in the great city of Nineveh, which had by then become the capital of the empire. The library that Ashurbanipal built at Nineveh was, without exaggeration, one of the wonders of the ancient world. It held tens of thousands of tablets covering every subject known to Mesopotamian civilization: medical texts, astronomical observations, mathematical calculations, prayers, hymns, omens, dream interpretations, historical chronicles, royal correspondence, personal letters, legal codes, and most gloriously, literature, the great epics of Mesopotamian civilization, including the fullest surviving version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, were preserved in his library. Without Ashurbanipal's obsessive collecting, we would not have that epic today. We would not know the story of the king who wept for his friend, who sought immortality across the ends of the earth, who returned home at last knowing that only the walls he built would outlive him. The library of Ashurbanipal is one of the great gifts of the ancient world to us, an act of preservation so vast and so systematic that it changed forever what could survive of Mesopotamian civilization. But even as Ashurbanipal sat in his palace reading tablets by lamplight, the empire around him was beginning to crack. The provinces resented Assyrian rule. Egypt slipped free. Babylon, rebuilt after Sennacherib's destruction, seethed under Assyrian domination. And to the east, in the mountains of Iran, a new power was rising, a people called the Medes, who had watched Assyrian brutality for generations and were now, at last, powerful enough to fight back. When Ashurbanipal died, around the year 631 before our era, the empire began to unravel with astonishing speed. Within 20 years, the Medes and the resurgent Babylonians, under a new king named Nabopolassar, had allied against Assyria. In the year 612 before our era, their combined armies marched on Nineveh itself. The siege was brutal. The walls, thick and high, held for a time. But in the end, the greatest city of the greatest empire the world had ever seen fell. The palaces burned. The libraries collapsed. The tablets, ironically, were baked hard by the fires that were meant to destroy them, and preserved for us to read 3,000 years later. The Assyrians, who had made themselves feared across 3 continents, were suddenly, catastrophically, gone, not gradually, not slowly, gone, and into the space they left, Babylon, phoenix-like, would rise once again. The fall of Nineveh sent a shockwave across the ancient world. For nearly 300 years the Assyrian Empire had seemed almost eternal, an immovable presence at the centre of everything. Its armies had marched wherever they wished. Its kings had received tribute from lands most Mesopotamians had never even seen. Its language, Akkadian, had become the diplomatic tongue of the entire Near East. And then, in a single generation, it was simply gone. The palaces of Nineveh burned. The libraries buried themselves beneath collapsing walls. The royal cities of Kalhu and Dur-Sharrukin fell silent. When the smoke cleared, a new world stood in the ashes, and at the heart of that world, once again, stood Babylon. The man who inherited the largest share of the former Assyrian Empire was Nabopolassar, the founder of what historians now call the Neo-Babylonian Empire. He was a shrewd, patient king who had allied himself with the Medes to bring Assyria down. and who now had the difficult task of building something lasting out of the ruins. He honoured the ancient gods of Babylon. He rebuilt canals. He strengthened the walls of his cities. And when he died, he passed his kingdom to his son, whose name has echoed through history longer than perhaps any other Mesopotamian ruler. Nebuchadnezzar II. Nebuchadnezzar came to the throne in the year 605 before our era, and for the next 43 years he ruled with a mixture of ambition and reverence that made his empire dazzle like nothing since Hammurabi. He campaigned relentlessly, extending Babylonian power across Syria and into the Levant. He besieged Jerusalem, not once but twice. In the year 586 before our era, after the Judeans rebelled a second time, he destroyed the city, tore down the great temple that Solomon had built, and carried thousands of Judeans into exile in Babylon. This event, remembered in the Hebrew Bible as the Babylonian captivity, would shape Jewish history and theology for centuries afterward, and it fixed Babylon in the imagination of the Western world as a symbol both of grandeur and of judgment. But Nebuchadnezzar was not simply a conqueror. He was, above all, a builder. He poured the wealth of his empire into transforming Babylon into the most magnificent city on earth. He raised its walls to heights that ancient travellers said were wide enough for chariots to race along their tops. He constructed the great Ishtar Gate, faced with brilliant blue-glazed bricks, and adorned with images of lions, bulls, and dragons in yellow and white. When you walk through the reconstructed portion of that gate today, in a museum in Berlin, you can still feel a little of what a visitor to ancient Babylon must have felt, walking beneath animals of divine power, stepping softly across a sky-blue field. Beyond the gate stretched the processional way, a broad ceremonial road that led to the heart of the city, lined with reliefs that proclaimed Babylon's greatness. At the centre of Babylon rose the ziggurat of Marduk, the great tower dedicated to the city's patron god. In later memory and the traditions preserved in Hebrew scripture, this tower would be recalled as the Tower of Babel, the monument whose builders reached toward heaven and were scattered for their pride. Whether that story reflects some folk memory of Nebuchadnezzar's ziggurat or something older still, we cannot say. But the tower was real. It rose in step terraces above the city, and around it stood the temple complex of Esagila, where priests attended to the statue of Marduk with the same devotion their ancestors had shown 2,000 years before at Eridu. Nebuchadnezzar restored temples across his kingdom with obsessive care, and his inscriptions boast not of battles won, but of shrines rebuilt. Legend, whispering through the centuries, added one more wonder to his city: the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Ancient writers described terraced gardens built high on platforms, watered by ingenious mechanisms, filled with trees and flowers from every corner of the empire. The story claimed that Nebuchadnezzar had built them for his queen, a woman from the mountains of Media who longed for the green hills of her homeland. Whether the gardens truly existed, or whether they belonged to some other city misremembered as Babylon, or whether they were entirely a poetic invention, has been debated for centuries, but the legend itself tells us something. Babylon, in the imagination of the ancient world, was the city where the impossible became real, where kings built gardens in the sky for the queens they loved. For all his magnificence, Nebuchadnezzar was mortal, and after his death in the year 562 before our era, his empire began to fray at the edges. His successors were weaker men, and one of them, a strange and thoughtful ruler named Nabonidus, made choices that alienated the powerful priesthood of Marduk. He spent long years away from Babylon in a distant Arabian oasis, worshipping the moon god Sin rather than the traditional patron of the city. His absence bred resentment. The priests grew angry. The people grew uneasy, and on the eastern horizon a new power was rising, more patient, more clever, more tolerant than any that had come before. His name was Cyrus, and he was the king of a people called the Persians. In a series of extraordinary campaigns, Cyrus had already conquered the Medes, absorbed the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia, and built an empire that stretched from the borders of India to the shores of the Aegean. Now in the year 539 before our era, he turned his attention to Babylon. His armies moved swiftly. The Babylonian forces, led by Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar, could not hold them back. When Cyrus reached the walls of Babylon, the city, weary of Nabonidus and disillusioned with its rulers, opened its gates. Cyrus entered not as a destroyer but as a liberator, and he was welcomed by priests who saw in him the restorer of Marduk's honour. He offered no massacre, he burned no temples. He proclaimed in an inscription now known as the Cyrus Cylinder that Marduk himself had chosen him to rule, and that he would allow displaced peoples to return to their homelands. Among those he freed were the Judean exiles brought to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. They were permitted to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple. For that act, the Hebrew Bible remembers Cyrus with startling generosity, calling him the Anointed of the Lord, one of the very few foreign rulers ever given such a title in the Scriptures. With that peaceful surrender in 539 before our era, the long story of independent Mesopotamia came, quietly to an end. For more than 3,000 years, the land between the rivers had produced kings of its own, empires of its own, civilizations that answered to no one but themselves. Sumer, Akkad, Ur, Babylon, Assyria, each in its turn had risen from that mud and reached toward the heavens. And now, in a single autumn, all of it passed under the rule of a foreign king, whose capital lay far to the east. The rivers still flowed, the temples still stood, the priests still sang, but the political heart of the world had moved, and Mesopotamia became, from that day forward, a province. It did not stay one thing for long. After the Persians came the Greeks, when Alexander the Great swept through in the year 331 before our era, dying only a few years later in the palaces of Babylon itself. After the Greeks came the Parthians, then the Sasanian Persians, then in the 7th century of our own era, the armies of Islam, who founded a new city on the banks of the Tigris and called it Baghdad. For a few centuries under the Abbasid caliphs, Baghdad became once again the most brilliant city on earth, a place of poets, mathematicians, astronomers, and philosophers, where knowledge preserved from the ancient world was translated, studied, and expanded. In some deep and quiet way, Mesopotamia had risen again, wearing new clothes, speaking a new language, worshipping in new ways, but sitting on the same soil, drinking from the same rivers, remembering, without always knowing it, the same ancient inheritance. That inheritance never truly disappeared. Even after cuneiform was forgotten, even after the ziggurats crumbled into shapeless mounds, even after the names of Enlil and Enki and Inanna passed out of living memory, Mesopotamia lived on inside us. It lived on in the way we count the minutes in an hour and the degrees in a circle, dividing them by 60, as the Sumerians did 4,000 years ago. It lived on in the shapes of our zodiac signs, in the traces of astronomy that Babylonian priests observed patiently from their temple platforms. It lived on in the biblical stories that shaped so much of Western culture, in the tale of a great flood, in the tower that reached toward heaven, in the exile beside the rivers of Babylon where captives sat down and wept. It lived on in the very idea of law codes carved in stone, in the idea of writing itself, in the idea that a city was more than a place, that a city was an organism, a stage, a story. When archaeologists in the 19th century first pushed their spades into the dusty mounds of Iraq and began to lift tablets from the earth, they did not know at first what they had found. It took decades of patient work to crack open the cuneiform script, to learn its signs, to hear again the voices that had been silent for 2,000 years. When those voices finally spoke, what they said astonished the world. They spoke of kings and floods, of prayers and love poems, of merchants complaining about bad copper, of scribes complaining about lazy students, of mothers writing to sons, of physicians describing symptoms, of astronomers charting the paths of stars. They spoke of a civilization so much older, so much richer, so much deeper than the modern world had ever imagined. The Bible, it turned out, was not the beginning of history. Greece, it turned out, was not the beginning of civilization. Something older lay beneath them both. Something patient and vast. Something that had been waiting under the sand for us to find it and to remember. To walk the ruins of Mesopotamia today is to walk on the shoulders of everyone who has ever lived in a city, obeyed a law, written a word, or looked up at the stars and wondered. Its cities are broken. Its gods are silent. Its languages are studied only in the quiet rooms of universities. But its inheritance is everywhere. It is in the room where you are sitting. It is in the clock ticking on your wall. It is in the alphabet you are reading. It is in the very idea that words can outlast the mouth that spoke them, that laws can outlast the king who wrote them, that a story told beside a fire can travel across 4,000 years and reach a stranger in a distant land. That is what Mesopotamia gave us, not just cities and kings, not just laws and temples, not just harvests and empires. It gave us the deep, stubborn human refusal to be forgotten. It gave us the belief that what we do here, in our short lives, in our small houses, on the banks of whatever river we happen to live near, matters, that it can be remembered, that it can be passed on. So tonight, as you settle into your quiet room, wherever in the world you are, know this. You are the descendant, in some invisible way, of a farmer who pressed the first seed into the mud of the Euphrates. You are the descendant of a scribe who learned to draw a sheep on wet clay. You are the descendant of a priest who watched the stars turn above a ziggurat. You are the descendant of a king who tried, and often failed, to give justice to his people. You are the descendant of a mother who told her child a story about a flood, and a friend, and a search for immortality, and a wall that would outlast them all. The rivers are still flowing. The story is still being told. And now, in your listening, in your remembering, in your quiet attention on this ordinary evening, you are one more voice in that long, unbroken conversation that began so many thousands of years ago in the land between the rivers. Sleep gently, wherever you are.